The story of Wu Wei begins not with a single lecture or a grand proclamation, but with the quiet flow of a river that refuses to force its way through the mountains, choosing instead to carve a path by simply being. Imagine the ancient banks of the Yellow River, the mist rising at dawn, the reeds bending to the current without resistance. It is in this gentle, relentless movement that Lao Tzu first sensed a deeper principle, a way of being that is less about doing and more about allowing. In the second chapter of the Tao Te Ching, he writes, "All things under heaven are born of the Tao gives birth to one gives birth to two gives birth to three, and three gives birth to all things." The passage does not command, it observes, inviting us to notice the spontaneous unfolding of the world. When Lao Tzu left the Zhou court, the legend says he rode an ox backward, his hair disheveled, his robe torn, his eyes fixed on the distant horizon. He was not fleeing, he was departing in the very manner of Wu Wei, without haste, without a destination imposed by the world's expectations. As the ox trudged along the dusty road, a passerby called out, "Old master, where are you going?" Lao Tzu answered, "I go where the wind takes me." The ox, a symbol of steadfast labor, carried him not forward but outward into the unknown. Embodying the uncarved block Pu that Taoist texts celebrate, the block is raw potential, untouched by the tools of ambition, ready to become whatever the Tao allows. It is a reminder that the most profound action sometimes looks like inaction, that the greatest influence can be felt in the spaces left untouched. Zhuangzi, a century or two later, deepened this vision with a story that still makes us smile and shiver. He describes a dream in which he was a butterfly fluttering carefree, unaware of the world of men. When he awoke, he wondered, "Am I Zhuangzi who has dreamed I am a butterfly, or a butterfly dreaming that I am Zhuangzi?" This paradox is not a whimsical riddle. It is a vivid illustration of the fluid boundary between self and the world. A boundary that Wu Wei dissolves. The dream shows that identity, intention, and effort are all, in the end, transformations of the same underlying Tao, moving without force. Another of Zhuangzi's anecdotes, the tale of the useless wooden sword, offers a concrete image of non-action that yields unexpected benefit. A craftsman fashioned a sword of fine wood, smooth and elegant, yet entirely ineffective in battle. When a warrior asked why he would make such a thing, the craftsman replied, "Because it cannot cut, it will never be taken into war, and therefore it will survive the ages." The sword's uselessness becomes its virtue, allowing it to persist while all functional weapons are destroyed. In this story, Wu Wei is not laziness. It is a strategic surrender of the ego's desire to dominate, letting the natural order determine the outcome. The wooden sword becomes a metaphor for the ruler who refrains from overregulation, trusting that the market, like the river, will find its own channels. Consider a humble farmer in the early Zhou dynasty, standing on a low ridge, watching the rain clouds gather. He does not build dams or divert the water with elaborate canals. Instead, he opens the sluice gates of his field at just the right moment, allowing the rain to flow into his paddies. He knows the timing, the soil's capacity, the pattern of the seasons. By doing nothing beyond what the natural conditions demand, he harvests a bountiful crop. This is Wu Wei in practice, a harmony between human intention and the world's rhythms, where the farmer's role is to be a responsive steward rather than a domineering commander. Similarly, a ruler of a small city-state in the spring and autumn period might observe the bustling market, the merchants shouting, the buyers haggling. Rather than imposing price controls or heavy taxes, he declares, "Let the market speak for itself." By stepping back, the ruler allows competition to prune inefficiencies, innovation to flourish, and the community to self-organize. The result is not chaos but a spontaneous order that reflects the underlying Tao. The ruler's non-action does not mean neglect, it means confidence in the inherent wisdom of the people and the natural flow of economic exchange. Yet these stories were not universally embraced. Confucian scholars, especially Mencius, raised serious objections. Mencius argued that the moral responsibility of a ruler is to actively cultivate virtue among his subjects, to intervene when injustice arises. He warned that non-action could become a convenient excuse for moral neglect, a way to avoid the hard work of governance. In his dialogues, Mencius asks, "If a ruler does nothing while his people suffer, is he not complicit in their suffering?" He points to the Confucian concept of ren, humaneness, as an active practice, a continuous effort to nurture benevolence. From this perspective, Wu Wei risks turning into indifference, a dangerous passivity that abandons the duty to correct wrongs. Legalist thinkers such as Han Fei took the critique further. For Han Fei, the stability of the state depends on strict laws and clear, Enforceable penalties, he wrote, the ruler must be the one who makes the law, and the law must be enforced without exception. In this view, any reliance on spontaneous order is a gamble, a relinquishing of the ruler's power to shape society. Han Fei feared that if a ruler does nothing, the resulting vacuum would be filled by factionalism, corruption, and disorder. The legalist emphasis on centralized control seems at odds with the Taoist trust in natural processes, creating a tension that would echo through Chinese political thought for centuries. These debates, however, are not merely oppositional, they also reveal points of convergence. The Confucian ideal of Ren shares with Taoism a concern for the well-being of all beings, though the methods differ. Ren calls for active compassion, while Wu Wei invites compassionate restraint. Both seek to align human conduct with a higher moral order, whether that order is expressed as the mandate of heaven or as the Tao. Moreover, later Buddhist teachings on non-attachment echo Taoist non-action. When a monk renounces desire, he does not become inert, he simply releases the grip that forces the mind into endless striving. The Buddhist notion of letting go mirrors the Taoist practice of effortless action, suggesting a shared insight across traditions, that true freedom arises when the self ceases to push against the current and instead moves with it. To illuminate these philosophical currents, let us revisit the wooden sword. Imagine a modern entrepreneur who, instead of chasing rapid growth, builds a product that serves a niche community, deliberately avoiding the pressures of venture capital. The product may appear useless in the eyes of the market's loudest voices, yet it persists, nurtures a loyal user base, and eventually influences larger trends. The entrepreneur's restraint, his refusal to over-engineer, to over-market, embodies Wu Wei, allowing the product to find its own path. Much like the wooden sword survived the ages precisely because it could not be used for war. Another vivid illustration comes from the ancient city of Lu, where a magistrate faced a flood threatening the grain stores. Rather than ordering immediate repairs, he instructed the townspeople to open the city gates and let the water flow through the streets. Trusting that the natural course would carry the flood away, the water passed, the grain stores remained intact, and the people learned to respect the river's power. The magistrate's decision was not a lack of concern, it was a strategic non-intervention that leveraged the river's own momentum. In the aftermath, the citizens praised his wisdom, recalling the Taoist teaching that the soft overcomes the hard. These anecdotes, both ancient and modern, illustrate the practical dimension of Wu Wei. They show that non-action is not synonymous with passivity, but rather a calibrated response that aligns intention with the conditions at hand. The farmer does not ignore the rain, he watches, he waits. He opens the gates at the precise moment. The ruler does not abandon the market, he steps aside, trusting that competition will self-regulate. The wooden sword does not cut, it endures. The butterfly does not cling to a single identity, it embraces transformation. When we return to Lao Tzu's verses, we find further depth. Chapter 37 states, "The Tao never does anything, yet nothing is left undone." This paradox invites us to contemplate how the universe operates without a master plan, how each leaf falls because it is ready, not because a force compels it. Chapter 48 adds, "In the pursuit of learning, one must be like a child, unburdened by preconceptions, open to the flow of experience." Here Lao Tzu suggests that the cultivated mind, like the uncarved block, remains receptive, allowing insight to arise naturally rather than forcing it through rigid analysis. Zhuangzi expands this vision with his famous passage on the usefulness of the useless. He writes, "Great usefulness is often hidden in the small and the seemingly useless." By valuing the wooden sword, he teaches that what appears to lack conventional power can possess a deeper, more enduring influence. This insight resonates with the modern concept of antifragility, where systems grow stronger by embracing volatility rather than resisting it. In both cases, the principle is that resilience emerges not from control, but from the capacity to adapt and flow. The historical anecdotes also reveal the social context in which Wu Wei emerged. The legend of Lao Tzu's departure on an ox reflects a time of political turbulence, when scholars sought refuge from court intrigue. The ox, a work animal, symbolizes the ordinary world, the everyday labor that continues regardless of philosophical speculation. By riding backward, Lao Tzu signals a reversal of conventional ambition, a turning away from the pursuit of rank and power toward a simpler, more authentic existence. The uncarved block becomes a cultural metaphor for humility, reminding the audience that greatness lies in the potential to become, not in the achievement of a fixed form. Zhuangzi's useless wooden sword, meanwhile, arises in an era of increasing militarization, where the sword was a symbol of authority and domination. By crafting a sword that cannot kill, Zhuangzi subverts the prevailing values, suggesting that true strength may lie in the capacity to abstain from violence. The story also serves as a critique of the legalist emphasis on law as a weapon of control, while the legalist ruler would sharpen swords to enforce order. Zhuangzi offers a quiet counter-strategy: make the instrument of force ineffective and the need for force disappears. The dialogues between Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism did not remain confined to scholarly debates. They shaped policies, court rituals, and everyday practices. For instance, the Han Dynasty, which claimed to follow Confucian ideals, also incorporated Taoist concepts of non-action into its governance, advising emperors to govern by virtue and not by law. Emperor Wu of Han famously said, "If the ruler follows the way, the people will follow without coercion." This synthesis reflects an acknowledgement that the strict legalist model alone could not sustain harmony, and that a measured application of Wu Wei could temper the harshness of law. In the centuries that followed, the Buddhist influx into China further enriched the conversation. The Buddhist principle of sunyata, emptiness, resonates with the Taoist notion of the uncarved block. Both point to a ground of potential beyond fixed forms. When a Buddhist monk speaks of letting go of attachment, he is, in effect, practicing a form of Wu Wei, allowing thoughts and emotions to arise and pass without grasping. The cross-pollination of ideas led to the development of Chan, Zen, Buddhism, where the famous koan of the sound of one hand clapping invites the practitioner to experience the Tao directly. Beyond conceptual effort, let us pause and consider how these ancient teachings might speak to us today. Imagine a modern city grappling with traffic congestion. Planners could impose strict tolls and heavy policing. A legalist approach, or they could design streets that naturally calm traffic, encouraging cyclists and pedestrians, a Wu Wei approach, by allowing the flow of people to shape the use of space. The city taps into the same principle Lao Tzu observed in the river. The result is a more livable environment, not because the authorities forced compliance, but because the design respected the natural tendencies of human movement. Or think of a corporate leader facing a crisis of morale. A Confucian response might involve issuing motivational speeches, setting clear ethical standards, and actively intervening to correct behavior. A Taoist leader practicing Wu Wei would step back, listen deeply, and create conditions where employees feel empowered to self-organize, trusting that the collective wisdom will surface. Both approaches aim for a harmonious workplace, yet the Taoist path emphasizes restraint, patience, and the belief that overmanagement can stifle the very creativity it seeks to nurture. The tension between action and non-action, between law and natural order, continues to animate philosophical discourse. Modern scholars such as Tu Weiming argue that Wu Wei can be understood as minimalist governance, a principle that can guide sustainable development. Others, like contemporary Confucian ethicist Ham Dong Seok, caution that without an ethical anchor, non-action can devolve into neglect. This ongoing dialogue echoes the ancient debates, reminding us that the balance is delicate and context-dependent. Returning to the primary texts, let us hear Lao Tzu's voice again. When the great Tao is forgotten, kindness and morality arise. When wisdom and learning appear, great hypocrisy follows. He warns that when the natural order is obscured, people cling to artificial constructs, rules, rituals, and forced actions that may appear moral but lack the spontaneity of the Tao. Zhuangzi, with his characteristic humor, adds, "The perfect man employs his mind like a mirror. It grasps nothing, it reflects everything. The mirror does not act, it simply reflects," embodying the essence of Wu Wei, being present without imposing. Mencius, on the other hand, declares, "The great man is he who does not forget his humanity, who acts to rectify the suffering of the people." He insists that moral action is a duty, not an optional stance. Han Fei, with his stern legalist tone, writes, "The ruler must be the one who wields the law like a sword, cutting through disorder." Both statements underscore a belief in the necessity of deliberate, forceful action to maintain order and virtue. Yet even within these critiques, there are seeds of convergence. Mencius acknowledges that a ruler who governs with benevolence can achieve the spontaneous compliance of the people, a phrase that hints at Wu Wei's subtle influence. Han Fei, while advocating strict law, also notes that the best laws are those that the people do not feel they are being governed by, suggesting an ideal where regulation blends seamlessly into daily life, much like the unnoticeable flow of water. In practice, ancient Chinese administrators often blended these philosophies. The The Tang dynasty's equal field system combined legalist land allocation with Taoist respect for the rhythms of agriculture. Officials would set the tax rates and then step back, allowing the peasants to manage their own fields according to seasonal patterns. The result was a period of relative stability and prosperity, a testament to the power of integrating Wu Wei with structured governance. The legacy of Wu Wei also lives on in artistic expression, in Chinese landscape painting. The brush strokes aim to capture the spirit of the mountains and rivers without forcing detail, allowing the ink to flow naturally on the paper. The painter becomes a conduit, not a commander, embodying the Taoist ideal of effortless action. Similarly, in calligraphy, the master practitioner moves the brush with a relaxed hand, letting the ink's weight guide the line. Each stroke is an act of Wu Wei, a harmony between intention and material. When we examine the modern world, we see that the principle of non-intervention can be a powerful tool for ecological stewardship. Conservationists who protect a wetland by simply preventing development rather than trying to engineer a new habitat practice a form of environmental Wu Wei. They trust that the ecosystem, left undisturbed, will maintain its own balance, much like the ancient farmer who trusts the rain to nourish his fields. In the realm of personal development, the practice of mindfulness echoes Taoist non-attachment. When we sit in meditation and observe thoughts without judgment, we are performing a subtle form of Wu Wei, allowing the mind's currents to pass without trying to catch or suppress them. The result is a calm clarity that enables wiser action, not forced action. The stories of Lao Zai's ox, the uncarved block, Zhuangzi's butterfly, and the wooden sword are not relics of a distant past. They are living metaphors that invite us to reconsider how we engage with the world. They ask us to ask, quietly, whether our most earnest efforts are sometimes better expressed as gentle allowances. They challenge the assumption that power always lies in overt control, suggesting instead that true influence may arise from the spaces we leave open. As we reflect on these teachings, consider the following. In your own life, where might you be trying to force a river to flow faster, when perhaps the banks are simply waiting for the water to find its own path? In your community, are there moments when stepping back could allow a more authentic order to emerge? Rather than imposing a rigid structure that may soon crack, the Taoist invitation is not to abandon responsibility, but to discern the moments when responsibility is best expressed through restraint. The dialogue between Taoism, Confucianism, and legalism reminds us that philosophical traditions are not isolated islands, but a network of ideas that constantly intersect, challenge, and enrich one another. The Confucian emphasis on Ren, the legalist focus on law, and the Taoist practice of Wu Wei each offer a lens through which to view human affairs. By holding these lenses side by side, we gain a more nuanced vision, one that appreciates the need for moral action, the necessity of clear rules, and the wisdom of allowing things to unfold naturally. In the final analysis, the historical roots of Wu Wei are not merely academic footnotes. They are a living heritage that continues to inform how we think about leadership, governance, ecology, and personal growth. The river still flows. The butterfly still dreams. The wooden sword still rests in a quiet corner, waiting to remind us that sometimes the most profound power lies in the gentle art of doing nothing, when and only when that nothing aligns with the deeper current of the Tao. The story of Wu Wei begins not with a sudden flash of insight, but with the gentle observation of a river that knows no hurry, yet carves valleys deeper than any hammer. Imagine standing on a quiet bank, watching water glide over stone, slipping around obstacles, softening the hardest rock not by force but by persistence, by the simple fact of being itself. In the ancient Chinese tradition, this image becomes a metaphor for a way of living, a philosophical foundation that asks us to ask a different question. Not how can I make the world bend to my will, but rather how can I move in harmony with the world so that the world in turn moves with me. This is the essence of Wu Wei, often translated as non-action or effortless action, but those translations, while useful, can also conceal the depth of the concept. To understand Wu Wei, we must first unpack three intertwined ideas: the notion of non-forced action, the principle of Zhuangzi, Chinese letter, naturalness or self-so, and the dynamic balance of yin and yang. Non-forced action does not mean inactivity. It means acting without artificial strain, without imposing an external agenda on the flow of events. It is the difference between pushing a cart uphill with a clenched grip, muscles tense, breath shallow, and guiding it with a light touch, feeling the hill's slope, letting the cart's wheels find the path of least resistance. The latter is Wu Wei. Zhuangzi, the second pillar, literally means self-so, or that which is so of itself. In Taoist texts, it is the quality of things that arise spontaneously, without contrivance, like a seed sprouting when the soil is ready, or a cloud drifting across the sky, unprompted by any master. Zuran is the naturalness of a bamboo grove swaying in the wind, each stalk bending in concert. Not because a gardener has arranged them, but because the wind's pressure is the same for all. When we speak of Zuran, we are pointing to a mode of existence that is unmediated by egoic intention. A state where the self is not a separate commander but an integral part of the larger pattern. Yin and Yang, the third element, is the ever-shifting polarity that underlies all change. Yin, the receptive, yielding, dark and soft. Yang, the active, bright and firm. Wu Wei does not deny action. It simply insists that action be balanced, that the Yang of effort be tempered by the Yin of receptivity. A musician improvising on a gyukin, for instance, does not pre-plan every note. The left hand moves with the breath, the right hand follows the resonance of the string. The melody unfolds in response to the silence between notes. The music is neither forced nor random. It is a dance of yin and yang, a spontaneous expression that embodies Wu Wei. The classical source for these ideas is the Tao Te Ching, attributed to Laozi. In Chapter 2, Laozi writes, "When the people of the world all know beauty as beauty, there is the recognition of ugliness. When they all know good as good, there is the recognition of evil." The passage hints at the relational nature of concepts, the way opposites define each other. In Chapter 3, he says, "Practice not doing, and the 10,000 things will develop themselves." The phrase, "practice not doing," Chinese letter, Wu Wei is not a call for laziness, but an invitation to cultivate a mode of being that allows the 10,000 things, every creature, every phenomenon, to unfold according to their own nature. To see how this works in practice, consider the example of water, which the Tao Te Ching uses repeatedly. Water is soft, yielding, yet it can wear down the hardest stone. Laozi writes, "Water is the great master. It benefits all things without striving. When water meets a rock, it does not crash into it with force. It slides, it seeps, it finds the cracks. And over time, it reshapes the rock. The power of water lies not in its strength, but in its adaptability, its willingness to follow the path of least resistance, to become one with the shape of the terrain. This is the power of aligning with the Tao. You become the water that shapes the world, not the hammer that tries to force the world into your shape." A second, more human illustration comes from the world of music. Imagine a jazz saxophonist in the middle of an improvisational solo. The notes that pour out are not the result of a pre-written score. They arise from the musician's breath. The timbre of the instrument, the rhythm of the band, the mood of the audience, even the ambient temperature of the room. The musician listens as much as he plays, allowing the music to respond to the moment, to the silence between phrases, to the subtle shift in the bassist's line. In this spontaneous creation, there is no forced agenda. There is an attunement to the present, a letting go of self-conscious control. The result is a performance that feels alive, fluid, and, paradoxically, more powerful than a meticulously rehearsed piece. The musician's mastery is not in his ability to dictate every note, but in his capacity to be receptive, to let the music flow through him, an embodiment of Wu Wei. These examples illustrate a central argument of Taoist philosophy. True power lies not in domination, but in alignment. When we align with the Tao, we become like water, like the improvising musician, moving with the currents of circumstance rather than against them. This alignment is not passive resignation, it is an active, discerning engagement that respects the natural order. The Tao itself is described as the nameless, the inexhaustible source, a principle that cannot be grasped through forceful conceptualization. To act in accordance with it is to act without overstepping the boundaries of what the world offers. One can trace this idea of alignment through other philosophical traditions. Aristotle, in his Metaphysics, posits the unmoved mover, a perfect final cause that initiates motion without itself being moved. While Aristotle's unmoved mover is a transcendent principle, the Tao is an immanent one, present in every ripple of water, every breath of wind. Yet both share the insight that the most fundamental source of motion is not a violent push, but a kind of pure, self-sufficient actuality that draws other things into motion. In this sense, Wu Wei can be seen as an operationalization of the unmoved mover. The sage, by embodying the Tao, becomes a conduit through which the world moves, without exerting coercive force. Spinoza offers another parallel in his concept of conatus, the striving of each thing to persist in its own being. For Spinoza, each mode of substance seeks to enhance its power of acting. But this striving is most effective when it follows the laws of nature, when the mind understands its place within the larger deterministic order. The wise person, for Spinoza, recognizes that true freedom is the knowledge of necessity, and that by aligning one's desires with the necessity of nature, one attains a kind of blessedness. This resonates deeply with the Taoist claim that freedom is found not in the assertion of will over the world, but in the surrender to the world's natural rhythm. In modern ecological philosophy, the principle of deep ecology echoes Wu Wei's call for non-forced interaction with the environment. Deep ecologists argue that humanity must recognize its embeddedness within the web of life, that attempts to dominate nature through technology and exploitation are ultimately self-defeating. The Taoist sage, by contrast, lives lightly, taking only what is needed, allowing ecosystems to maintain their integrity. Both perspectives converge on the insight that sustainable power comes from partnership, not conquest. Despite these resonances, Wu Wei has faced persistent misreadings, especially when it traveled westward. One common Western misinterpretation equates Wu Wei with laziness, with a kind of fatalistic resignation to fate. This reading often stems from a superficial gloss of non-action as doing nothing. If one were to take the phrase at face value, it could be twisted into an excuse for inertia. Why bother working hard? Just wait for things to happen on their own. Yet the Taoist texts are explicit in rejecting such passivity. In chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching, Laozi advises, in the pursuit of learning, one should not be proud of knowledge, but should be modest and willing to be guided. The emphasis is on humility, not on abandonment. The sage does act, but his actions are calibrated to the context, never excessive, always in tune with the flow. A second, more philosophical critique emerges from existentialist thought, particularly from Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre famously claimed that existence precedes essence, and that human freedom is rooted in the capacity to choose, to define oneself through acts of will. For Sartre, freedom is a burden, a weight that demands constant, active decision-making. He might argue that Wu Wei, by suggesting a surrender to the Tao, undermines authentic freedom, reducing the individual to a passive vessel. Sartre's condemnation to be free seems at odds with a philosophy that encourages letting go of the will. In response, Taoist scholars point out that Sartre's conception of freedom is predicated on a dualistic split between self and world, whereas Taoism dissolves that split, when the self is not a separate commander. The act of choosing loses its oppressive weight. The sage's freedom is not the freedom to arbitrarily impose one's will, but the freedom to act in accordance with the Tao, which is itself the ultimate source of all possibilities. In this sense, Wu Wei can be read as a higher form of freedom, one that is not limited by the anxiety of choice because the choice is already aligned with the natural order. The paradox is that by not choosing, one actually chooses the most harmonious path. To illuminate how these ideas played out historically, consider the reign of Emperor Wu of Han, who ruled from 141 to 87 BCE. Though known for his aggressive expansionist policies and the centralization of power, Emperor Wu also became a patron of Taoist scholars, inviting them to his court to discuss the Tao and its applications to governance. One anecdote tells of the Taoist master Liu Wen, who presented the emperor with a jade disc inscribed with the characters Wu Wei. The emperor, intrigued, asked how a ruler could practice non-action while maintaining order. Liu Wen replied, "When the ruler follows the Tao, the people will follow without compulsion. The empire will be like a well-tuned instrument, each string resonating naturally." Emperor Wu, impressed, reportedly reduced heavy taxation for a period, allowing the peasantry to flow like water in their fields, thereby stabilizing the realm. This episode demonstrates that Wu Wei was not merely a mystical abstraction, but a practical political strategy, one that could temper the hard edge of imperial authority with the softness of natural governance. A second historical vignette comes from early Chan, Zen Buddhism in China. Around the 6th and 7th centuries CE, the Chan master Shenziu, in his famous Four Gates teaching, emphasized the practice of no mind, Chinese letter wuxin, a state in which the mind does not cling to thoughts, concepts, or desires. This no mind is essentially an embodiment of Wu Wei. The practitioner acts without the interference of a self-generated narrative. One story recounts a monk during a moment of intense meditation, hearing a sudden crack of thunder. Rather than startle, he simply smiled, allowing the sound to pass through him without judgment, and then continued his breath. The monk's response was praised as the perfect illustration of acting without acting, a hallmark of Chan practice that directly borrowed from Taoist Wu Wei. The integration of Wu Wei into Chan demonstrates how the principle transcended its original cultural context. finding new expression in the Buddhist pursuit of enlightenment, where the cessation of dualistic thinking mirrors the Taoist dissolution of self-other boundaries. These historical moments show that Wu Wei is a living philosophy, one that has been invoked to temper political power, to deepen spiritual practice, and to guide everyday conduct. In contemporary life, the principle can be applied in many arenas. Consider the field of conflict resolution. A mediator who adopts a Wu Wei stance does not dominate the conversation, does not impose a solution from above. Instead, the mediator creates a space where each party can express themselves, listens deeply, and allows the underlying interests to surface naturally. By refraining from forceful persuasion, the mediator often witnesses a resolution emerge organically as the parties recognize their shared humanity. This approach mirrors the Taoist emphasis on governing by non-interference, a method that yields more lasting peace than any decree could. In the realm of leadership, the concept of servant leadership resonates with Wu Wei. A leader who practices non-forced action empowers employees, provides resources, and steps back, trusting the team's innate abilities to solve problems. When a crisis arises, such a leader does not micromanage. They align themselves with the team's flow, offering guidance only where the natural order calls for it. The result is a resilient organization that adapts like water to changing market conditions, rather than a rigid hierarchy that breaks under pressure. In personal well-being, the practice of mindful movement, yoga, tai chi, qigong, embodies Wu Wei. The practitioner does not strain to achieve a pose. Rather, they observe the body's limits, breathe, and allow the movement to emerge from the center. Over time, the body learns to move with greater ease, strength, and balance, precisely because the practitioner respects the natural limits of their own flesh. This is the lived experience of effortless effort, a phrase that captures the paradox of Wu Wei. The greatest achievement often appears as the least effort. Returning to philosophical cross-references, we can see how the Taoist notion of aligning with the Tao parallels the Buddhist concept of Tathagatagarbha, the innate Buddha nature that is revealed when the mind ceases to fabricate. Both traditions suggest that the true self is not an autonomous ego but a luminous, unconditioned presence that becomes apparent when artificial constructs are set aside. In Western philosophy, the Stoics speak of living according to nature, a maxim that invites individuals to accept the world's rational order and to cultivate inner tranquility. The Stoic sage, like the Taoist sage, seeks to harmonize internal disposition with external reality, recognizing that resistance creates suffering, whereas acceptance yields peace. Even modern physics offers a poetic echo of Wu Wei. In quantum field theory, particles are understood not as isolated points but as excitations of underlying fields that permeate space. The behavior of these fields is governed by symmetry and minimal action principles. Systems evolve along paths that minimize energy expenditure. The universe, in this view, prefers the path of least resistance, a literal embodiment of the Taoist ideal that the most effective action is the one that expends the least force. While scientific language differs from philosophical metaphor, the underlying intuition aligns. The cosmos is structured in such a way that effortless action is the most natural state. To further illustrate the practical potency of Wu Wei, let us examine two concrete modern examples. First, the design philosophy of biomimicry, championed by architects like Janine Benyus, draws directly from nature's solutions. Benyus writes, "Nature has already solved many of the problems we face if we only learn to read its language." In designing a building that regulates temperature without mechanical HVAC, engineers study termite mounds, which maintain a constant internal climate through passive ventilation. By mimicking this natural system, the building achieves comfort with minimal energy input, an architectural embodiment of Wu Wei. The structure does not force climate control, it aligns with the natural flow of air and heat. Second, the practice of agile software development mirrors the improvisational musician. Agile teams work in short iterations, constantly reviewing and adapting to feedback, rather than following a rigid top-down plan. The Scrum Master, akin to the Chan Master, facilitates the process, removes impediments, and then steps back, allowing the team's collective intelligence to guide the product's evolution. This approach recognizes that complex systems, like software markets, cannot be fully predicted. The most effective strategy is to stay responsive, to let the product shape itself through interaction with users. Much like water shapes the rock it meets, these examples underscore a recurring pattern. When humans align their actions with the underlying dynamics of a system, be it ecological, social, or technological, the outcomes are more sustainable, more resilient, and often more beautiful. The Taoist sage, by embodying Wu Wei, becomes a conduit for this alignment, a living bridge between intention and the natural order. Nevertheless, the path of Wu Wei is not without challenges. One must guard against the temptation to use non-action as a cover for indecision or avoidance. The Taoist classic warns, "The soft overcomes the hard, the weak overcomes the strong." Softness, however, is not synonymous with weakness. It is a cultivated strength that knows when to push and when to yield. A leader who misinterprets Wu Wei as a license to do nothing may find their organization faltering, just as a student who mistakes mindfulness for escapism may drift away from responsibility. The true practice requires discernment, a constant calibration of when to act and when to step back, guided by an attuned sensitivity to the context. In addressing the existentialist critique, it helps to recall Sartre's own admission that man is condemned to be free. The condemnation lies in the awareness that one must choose, and that each choice defines one's essence. Taoism does not deny this awareness, rather, it reframes the source of choice, when the self is no longer an isolated commander but a participant in the Tao. The burden of choice is alleviated because the choices that arise are already in harmony with the larger pattern. The freedom celebrated by Sartre, freedom from external determinism, finds a complementary freedom in Taoism, freedom from internal compulsions that drive us to act against the grain of nature. Another counter-argument often raised by contemporary ethicists is that Wu Wei might excuse moral passivity in the face of injustice. If one simply goes with the flow, does one not risk becoming complicit when the flow is unjust? This is a serious concern. Taoist texts, however, do not advocate blind acquiescence. The Tao itself is neutral. But the sage discerns the quality of the flow. When a river becomes polluted, the sage does not simply watch the water turn black, he seeks to restore its purity, perhaps by removing the source of contamination. In political terms, the sage may intervene but does so with a sense of proportion, avoiding heavy-handed coercion. The principle of non-forced action thus becomes a call for proportionate, context-sensitive response, not a carte blanche for inaction. In modern environmental discourse, this nuance is vital. Climate activists who invoke the wisdom of the Tao often argue for systemic change that works with natural cycles, restoring wetlands, rewilding forests rather than imposing top-down solutions that ignore local ecosystems. The emphasis is on partnership, on allowing the Earth's own regenerative capacities to be expressed. This approach counters the criticism that non-action is a passive stance. It is instead an active stewardship that respects the limits and potentials inherent in natural systems. To deepen our appreciation of the historical depth of Wu Wei, let us revisit the anecdote of Emperor Wu of Han in greater detail. Emperor Wu, whose reign marked the zenith of the Han dynasty's territorial expansion, was also known for his patronage of Confucianism, which he used to legitimize his rule. Yet, despite his reputation as a hard-nosed ruler, he invited the Taoist hermit Zhang Daoling to his court. Zhang, later revered as the founder of the Way of the Celestial Masters, presented the emperor with a simple wooden cup inscribed with the characters non-action. When the emperor asked, "How can a ruler who must command an empire practice non-action?" Zhang replied, "When the ruler governs by virtue, the people will be like fish in a clear stream, no need for nets." The emperor, intrigued, instituted a period of tax relief and reduced forced labor, allowing the peasantry to tend their fields with a sense of autonomy. Within a few years, agricultural yields rose, and the empire enjoyed a period of relative stability. This episode illustrates that Wu Wei, when applied judiciously, can reinforce rather than undermine political authority by fostering a climate where subjects act in accordance with their own interests, which, when aligned with the state's welfare, produce a harmonious whole. Turning to the Chan anecdote, the story of the silent bell is often recounted in Zen monasteries. A monk was instructed to strike a bell and then remain silent, listening to the resonance. As the bell's tone faded, the monk's mind raced, trying to grasp the lingering sound. The master intervened, saying, "The bell has ceased to ring, but the emptiness it leaves is the true sound." The master's teaching aligns with Wu Wei. The monk's initial effort to cling to the sound, an act of forced attention, obscured the natural silence that followed. By letting go of the desire to hold onto the tone, the monk experienced the spontaneous emergence of emptiness, a state of no mind that is both action and non-action. This practice demonstrates how Wu Wei can be cultivated through meditation, allowing the mind to act without the interference of conceptual overlay. In the realm of literature, the principle of Wu Wei has inspired poets and writers across centuries. The Tang poet Li Bai, famed for his spontaneous verses, often wrote of drifting like clouds, moving like water. In one poem he declares, "I ride the wind, I am the wind, I am the cloud, I act without effort. Yet the world moves with me." Li Bai's poetry captures the aesthetic dimension of Wu Wei, a life lived in poetic flow, where the act of creation itself becomes an effortless extension of the natural world. His work, in turn, influenced later literary movements, such as the Japanese wabi-sabi aesthetic, which celebrates simplicity, imperfection, and the beauty of things that arise without artifice. These cross-cultural resonances underscore the universality of the non-forced action motif. From a psychological perspective, modern research on flow states, pioneered by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, provides empirical support for the benefits of Wu Wei. Flow is described as a state of deep absorption where the individual's skills match the challenge, leading to a loss of self-consciousness and a feeling of effortlessness. Athletes, artists, and surgeons often report that during flow, their actions seem to arise spontaneously, guided by an internal rhythm rather than deliberate calculation. This phenomenology mirrors the Taoist description of acting without acting. The difference, however, is that flow is typically achieved through disciplined practice, suggesting that Wu Wei is not a natural gift bestowed upon a few, but a cultivated capacity that can be nurtured through mindful training. In ethics, the principle of least harm aligns with Wu Wei. When policymakers design interventions that disturb the social fabric as little as possible, they embody the Taoist preference for minimal interference. The concept of soft power, introduced by Joseph Nye, also reflects this idea: influence achieved through attraction and cultural appeal, rather than coercion or force. Nations that wield soft power effectively practice a form of political Wu Wei, shaping global norms by embodying values that others naturally adopt. Rather than imposing sanctions or military might, let us now explore the interplay between yin-yang and Wu Wei in more depth. Yin and yang are not static opposites, they are dynamic, constantly transforming into each other. When yang becomes excessive, when action becomes overbearing, the yin aspect, receptivity, must increase to restore balance. Conversely, when the world is in a state of inertia, a surge of yang is needed to awaken movement. Wu Wei, therefore, is the skillful modulation of this dance. A skilled gardener knows when to prune yang and when to let the vines grow unchecked. Yin. In governance, a ruler might issue decisive decrees during crisis, yang, then withdraw, allowing local autonomy to flourish during peace, yin. The Taoist sage, attuned to this rhythm, knows precisely when to intervene and when to step aside. The Tao Te Ching's chapter 48 offers a poetic encapsulation. In the pursuit of learning, there is no end. The sage does not accumulate knowledge, but lets it flow. This line suggests that wisdom itself is not a static collection of facts, but a living current that one must align with. When we cling to rigid doctrines, we create a barrier to the Tao's flow. When we allow our understanding to be fluid, we become receptive to new insights, just as water absorbs the shape of each vessel it enters. In contemporary business strategy, the concept of pivot in startups can be seen through a Taoist lens. A startup that clings rigidly to an original business model, despite market feedback, is acting with forced intention, ignoring the yin of market signals. A successful pivot involves recognizing the changing environment, letting go of the old plan, and moving in a new direction that aligns with emerging opportunities. This is a strategic embodiment of Wu Wei. The organization does not force the market to conform, it adjusts its course to the natural flow of demand. The practice of mindful eating also illustrates Wu Wei in everyday life. When one eats with full attention, savoring each bite, the body's natural hunger and satiety signals guide the amount consumed. There is no need to count calories obsessively or to impose strict dietary regimes. The eater simply aligns with the body's intrinsic regulation. This approach reduces the stress associated with dieting and promotes a healthier relationship with food, echoing the Taoist principle that the body, like water, knows how to maintain its balance when left undisturbed by excessive control. In the realm of education, the Montessori method reflects Wu Wei. Children are offered prepared environments that invite exploration. The teacher's role is not to direct every activity but to observe, to intervene only when the child's natural curiosity needs guidance. By respecting the child's intrinsic drive to learn, the educator practices non-forced action, allowing knowledge to arise spontaneously. This pedagogy resonates with the Taoist belief that teaching without teaching yields deeper understanding than didactic instruction. Even in the sphere of personal relationships, Wu Wei offers a gentle roadmap. When partners approach each other with openness without trying to control the other's thoughts or feelings, the relationship flows more naturally. Conflict is not avoided, but addressed with a calm presence that does not force a particular outcome, allowing both parties to express themselves and to find a resolution that feels organic. The principle of non-interference here does not mean indifference. It means a respectful space where each person can be themselves, much like two streams that merge without losing their distinct currents. To bring these threads together, let us reflect on a final metaphor. Picture a sailboat on a vast ocean. The sailor cannot move the boat by pulling the sail against the wind. Instead, she adjusts the sail to catch the wind's energy, allowing the boat to glide forward. The sailor's skill lies not in brute force, but in the subtle art of alignment, reading the wind, feeling the water, timing the adjustments. This is the sailor's Wu Wei. The ocean, the wind, the boat, and the sailor are all participants in a dance of yin and yang, each contributing to the motion without imposing dominance. When the sailor tries to fight the wind, the boat stalls. When she yields to the wind's direction, the journey becomes effortless. In closing, the philosophical foundations of Wu Wei, non-forced action, naturalness, and the yin-yang balance offer a timeless guide for navigating the complexities of life. By aligning our actions with the Tao, we tap into a source of power that is subtle yet profound, as enduring as water shaping stone, as spontaneous as a musician's improvisation. The arguments in favor of this alignment find echoes in Aristotle's unmoved mover, Spinoza's conatus, and modern ecological thought. Counter-arguments, whether from Western misreadings that reduce Wu Wei to laziness, or from existentialist claims that freedom demands active choice, invite us to sharpen our understanding, to recognize that true freedom may reside not in the relentless assertion of will, but in the graceful surrender to the world's inherent rhythms. Historical anecdotes from Emperor Wu's court and the early Chan masters remind us that this philosophy has been lived, tested, and refined across centuries. Real-world applications, from biomimicry in architecture to agile methodologies in software, from conflict mediation to sustainable governance, demonstrate that Wu Wei is not an abstract ideal but a practical compass. Through analogies of water, music, sailing, and flow, we see how the principle translates into concrete experience. And through primary source quotes, Laozi's verses on practicing not doing, Zhang Daoling's counsel to the Han Emperor, Shenziu's teachings on no mind, we hear the voices of those who have walked this path before us. As we contemplate the Tao, let us remember that the journey is not a climb up a steep hill, but a glide along a gentle slope. When we release the impulse to dominate, when we cultivate the humility to listen, when we balance the active and the receptive, we discover that the greatest strength lies in the art of doing nothing, and yet, in doing everything that the world invites us to do. This is the heart of Wu Wei, the timeless invitation to live in harmony with the flow of existence. Imagine a ruler who does not force, who does not command, yet whose realm thrives in peace. Picture a society where laws are so light they are barely felt, and yet order endures as naturally as a river follows its course. This is the paradox at the heart of Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of non-action or effortless action. In the realm of ethics and politics, Wu Wei invites us to ask a simple yet profound question. Can the art of governing be achieved not by imposing will, but by letting go? To explore this question, we must first travel back to the earliest texts that gave Wu Wei its shape. In the De Jing, Laozi writes, "The sage does not hoard, the more he does for the people. The less they rely on him, he leads without a trace, and the people are content." This line, terse and poetic, already hints at a political vision. The ruler's power is most effective when it is invisible, when the people are so secure that they need not feel the hand of authority. Zhuangzi expands the idea with a vivid image of a carpenter who, after mastering his craft, no longer forces the wood but allows it to shape itself. When the tool is no longer needed, the carpenter steps back and the wood stands on its own. In political terms, the tool is law, the carpenter is the ruler, and the wood is the community. The earliest historical embodiment of this ideal appears in the legendary reign of King Wen of Zhou, a figure who, according to the Book of Documents, reduced taxes to a light touch and let the agrarian people tend their fields without the heavy burdens of tribute. The narrative tells us that King Wen did not demand the grain of the people, but let the fields speak for themselves. By lowering the fiscal pressure, he cultivated a sense of abundance that made the populace willingly obedient. Not through coercion but through gratitude. The low tax policy was not a mere economic decision. It was a political enactment of Wu Wei, a deliberate choice to govern by restraint. centuries later. The Tang dynasty offered another illustration of light-touch administration. Emperor Taizong, praised in the Old Book of Tang for his humble governance, famously instructed his officials to leave the people alone, and they will prosper on their own. In practice, this meant delegating authority to local magistrates, reducing the frequency of imperial edicts, and allowing market forces to determine prices. The result was a flourishing economy, a period of cultural flowering, and a relatively stable political order that seemed to flow rather than be forced. Scholars such as Liu Zhiji later recorded that the empire's strength lay not in the number of commands, but in the silence of the throne. The Tang experience shows how Wu Wei can be operationalized at the scale of a vast empire, not merely as a personal virtue, but as a systemic principle. If we move forward to the modern era, the resonance of Wu Wei can be heard in places that explicitly design governance around well-being rather than growth. Bhutan, for instance, has adopted gross national happiness (GNH) as a guiding metric. The GNH framework emphasizes sustainable development, cultural preservation, environmental conservation, and good governance. In practice, the Bhutanese government minimizes intrusive regulation, allowing communities to manage their own resources while providing a gentle guiding hand through policy. The result is a nation that, while modest in economic terms, consistently ranks high on happiness indices. The Bhutanese approach mirrors Wu Wei. The state steps back, trusts the innate capacities of its citizens, and intervenes only when the natural balance is threatened. On the other side of the spectrum, libertarian thinkers such as Robert Nozick have argued for a minimal state that exists solely to protect individual rights, leaving all other aspects of life to voluntary association. Nozick's night watchman state is, in a sense, a Western articulation of Wu Wei. The government does not micromanage, it simply ensures that no one harms another, and then lets the market and civil society organize themselves. The libertarian minimal state theory, while grounded in a very different philosophical tradition, shares the Taoist conviction that the most effective governance often consists of the least interference. Yet, for every advocate of governing by letting go, there are powerful counter-arguments that demand our attention. Niccolò Machiavelli, writing in the early 16th century, famously contended that a ruler must be decisive, even ruthless, to maintain stability. In The Prince, he argues that it is necessary for a prince to be both a lion and a fox, implying that a ruler must actively intervene, shape events, and sometimes use force to preserve order. From Machiavelli's perspective, the idea of a ruler who merely steps aside risks inviting chaos, rebellion, or foreign invasion, the very notion of non-action could be interpreted as weakness, a vacuum that ambitious rivals would rush to fill. Similarly, Thomas Hobbes, in his seminal work Leviathan, posits that without a strong sovereign, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish. In short, Hobbes's social contract theory rests on the premise that individuals surrender their freedoms to an absolute authority to escape the natural state of war. In Hobbes's view, a ruler who refrains from decisive action would fail to provide the security necessary for civil society to function. The let-go approach, then, could be seen as an invitation to anarchy, a surrender to the war of all against all. These critiques raise essential questions. Does Wu Wei demand a naive trust in human nature? Does it underestimate the necessity of coercive power in moments of crisis? To answer, we must look beyond abstract theory and examine how Wu Wei has been practiced, adapted, and sometimes misinterpreted throughout history. Consider the Song dynasty, an era celebrated for its intellectual vigor and bureaucratic refinement. Within the Song court, a group of scholar officials championed what they called quiet governance, Chinese letter. They believed that the best way to maintain social harmony was to minimize direct interference in the daily lives of the people. One such official, Fan Zhongyan, famously wrote, "When the people are content, the ruler need not intervene. When the ruler intervenes, the people become restless." These officials reduced tax burdens, limited the frequency of imperial examinations, and emphasized local self-government. Their approach was not passive. It required a sophisticated understanding of when to act and when to step back. The Song experience suggests that Wu Wei is not a blanket policy of inaction, but a calibrated responsiveness that respects the natural rhythms of society. In a more contentious example, Mao Zedong's early rural experiments in the 1930s invoked Wu Wei rhetoric to justify a hands-off approach to land reform. Mao's communists, operating in remote villages, proclaimed that they would let the peasants speak for themselves, allowing local committees to decide on the redistribution of land. In practice, however, the revolutionary leadership retained tight control over the process, intervening whenever local decisions threatened broader strategic goals. The juxtaposition of Mao's rhetorical invocation of Wu Wei with the reality of centralized command highlights a paradox. The language of non-action can be employed to legitimize both genuine decentralization and covert domination. It reminds us that the ethical weight of Wu Wei depends not only on the principle itself, but on the integrity of those who claim to practice it. To further illuminate the contemporary relevance of Wu Wei, let us turn to the concept of soft power, a term coined by Joseph Nye to describe the ability of a state to shape the preferences of others through attraction rather than coercion. Soft power operates much like Wu Wei. It works subtly through culture, values, and institutions, rather than through overt force. A nation that cultivates a positive image, invests in education, and respects international norms can influence global affairs without the need for hard power. In this sense, soft power can be viewed as a modern, secular articulation of the Taoist art of governing without governing. Analogies can help us grasp the delicate balance required in Wu Wei governance. Imagine a gardener tending a bamboo forest. The gardener does not pull every shoot. Instead, she clears the weeds, ensures adequate water, and steps back, allowing the bamboo to sway in the wind. If she tries to shape each stalk, the forest becomes stunted. Likewise, a ruler who constantly micromanages may suppress the natural growth of civic institutions, while a ruler who knows when to prune and when to let the bamboo stand tall fosters a resilient, self-sustaining community. Another analogy comes from music. A skilled pianist does not press every key with force. She lets the melody breathe, allowing silence to punctuate the notes. The silence, though empty, gives shape and meaning to the music. Wu Wei in politics functions as that silence, a space in which citizens can hear their own voices, organize, and act. The ruler's role is to provide the quiet backdrop that makes the symphony possible, not to dominate the composition. Returning to the ancient texts, we find further support for this vision. In the Zhuangzi, there is a story of Cook Ding who, after years of carving oxen, moves his knife with such effortless precision that he cuts the joints without touching the meat. He attributes his skill to following the natural way, a metaphor for aligning action with the underlying structure of reality. The political lesson is clear. A ruler who has internalized the natural order can act without force, guiding the state with a subtle hand that respects the innate patterns of human cooperation. The Confucian ideal of the Zhuangzi, the gentleman or superior person, provides a complementary perspective. The Zhuangzi is expected to cultivate personal virtue, to act with benevolence, righteousness, propriety, and wisdom, while Confucianism emphasizes active moral leadership. It also acknowledges the importance of restraint. The Analects record Confucius saying, "When the ruler governs by virtue, the people are naturally obedient. When the ruler governs by force, the people are naturally rebellious." This convergence suggests that the ethical dimension of Wu Wei is not at odds with Confucian moral cultivation. Rather, it enriches it by highlighting the power of moral authority that does not need to coerce. In contemporary political theory, deliberative democracy offers a framework that resonates with Wu Wei. Deliberative democracy stresses the importance of public reasoning, inclusive dialogue, and the creation of spaces where citizens can deliberate without heavy-handed direction from the state. The state, in this model, acts as a facilitator rather than a commander, echoing the Taoist notion of governing by letting go. The philosopher Eugen Habermas argues that legitimacy arises when the public sphere is open, allowing rational discourse to shape policy. This approach aligns with the Taoist belief that when the people are left to find their own path, a harmonious order emerges organically. Let us now examine concrete, modern examples that illustrate how Wu Wei can be operationalized in policy. The first is the Nordic model of flexicurity, particularly evident in Denmark's labor market. The Danish government provides a robust safety net while maintaining a flexible labor market that allows employers to adjust quickly to economic changes. The state does not micromanage each employment contract. Instead, it sets broad standards, trusts employers and employees to negotiate, and intervenes only to prevent systemic failures. This balance of security and flexibility mirrors the Taoist principle of yielding without surrendering structure. A second example can be found in the city of Portland, Oregon's approach to urban planning in the early 21st century. Rather than imposing a top-down master plan, the city adopted a growth boundary policy that set a flexible perimeter for development and then allowed neighborhoods to determine their own density and design within that limit. The government's role was to define the outer limits, the frame, while the community filled in the details. This light-touch strategy encouraged organic, community-driven growth, reducing the need for constant regulatory revisions. Both examples demonstrate that Wu Wei does not imply an absence of policy, it implies a calibrated restraint, a strategic choice of where to intervene and where to step back. The underlying logic is that overregulation can stifle innovation, erode trust, and create resistance, whereas a well-timed, minimal intervention can foster resilience, adaptability, and a sense of shared responsibility. Nevertheless, the counter-arguments of Machiavelli and Hobbes remind us that the world is not always a tranquil river. Crises, wars, pandemics, economic collapses often demand swift, decisive action. In such moments, the principle of non-action could be interpreted as negligence. How, then, can a Wu Wei-informed state respond without betraying its core ethos? One answer lies in the distinction between action and intervention. A Wu Wei ruler can act decisively, but only when the action aligns with the deeper natural order, not when it is motivated by personal ambition or fear. This subtlety is captured in the Tao Te Ching's paradox, he who does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone. The ruler's decisive moves are not arbitrary, they are guided by an intuitive attunement to the underlying flow of events. To illustrate this nuance, consider the response of the Chinese government during the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic. Initially, the central authorities adopted a wait-and-see posture, allowing localities to manage their own containment measures. When the virus spread beyond the capacity of local systems, the central government intervened decisively, imposing nationwide lockdowns and mobilizing resources at an unprecedented scale. The shift from a light-touch approach to a forceful intervention was not a contradiction of Wu Wei, but a calibrated response to a changing reality. The initial restraint respected the autonomy of local governance, while the later decisive action reflected an alignment with the emergent need for coordinated effort. Historical anecdotes further illuminate how the balance between restraint and intervention has been negotiated. In the early Song dynasty, the Chancellor Wang Anshi attempted sweeping reforms, known as the New Policies, that aimed to centralize fiscal control and increase state involvement in the economy. The reforms faced fierce opposition from scholar officials who championed quiet governance. Their resistance was not rooted in a desire for anarchy, but in a belief that the reforms disrupted the natural equilibrium of the market and the social fabric. Ultimately, Wang's policies were rolled back, and the Song court returned to a more hands-off approach, reaffirming the Taoist conviction that overregulation can be counterproductive. Another anecdote comes from Mao Zedong's early rural experiments in the Jiangxi Soviet. Mao encouraged peasants to organize themselves into mutual aid teams, proclaiming that the revolution would flourish if the people were allowed to govern themselves. In practice, the Communist Party retained tight ideological control, directing the teams and intervening whenever local decisions conflicted with broader revolutionary goals. The rhetoric of Wu Wei was employed to inspire participation, yet the reality was a blend of empowerment and oversight. This duality illustrates the danger of invoking Wu Wei merely as a slogan without a genuine commitment to decentralized authority. These stories underscore a crucial lesson. The ethical potency of Wu Wei rests on the sincerity of the ruler's intent and the depth of their understanding of the social context. When the principle is used as a veneer for neglect or for covert domination, it loses its moral force. When, however, it is embraced as a guiding philosophy, it can inspire policies that nurture autonomy, foster trust, and create conditions in which citizens voluntarily align with the common good. Cross-referencing with other philosophical traditions deepens our appreciation of Wu Wei's relevance. The ancient Greek concept of phronsis, or practical wisdom, as articulated by Aristotle, emphasizes the ability to discern the right means to achieve the good life. Balancing deliberation with action. A ruler possessing phronsis knows when to intervene and when to step aside, echoing the Taoist balance of action and non-action. Similarly, the Buddhist notion of yupeya, skillful means, teaches that compassionate action must be adapted to the capacities of those involved, a principle that resonates with the Taoist emphasis on attunement to the natural flow of circumstances. In modern political thought, deliberative democracy, as mentioned earlier, offers a procedural embodiment of Wu Wei. The work of scholars such as John Rawls and Eugen Habermas stresses that legitimacy arises when citizens are given genuine opportunities to deliberate, and the state's role is to ensure that the arena for discourse remains open and fair. This mirrors the Taoist ruler who creates a space in which the people can find their own path. Moreover, the concept of soft power, which relies on attraction, cultural influence, and moral authority rather than coercion, can be seen as an external expression of Wu Wei in international relations. A nation that projects confidence, cultural richness, and ethical standards can shape global norms without resorting to hard power, much like a Taoist ruler who governs without overt commands. Let us now consider two concrete, modern illustrations that bring these ideas into everyday experience. First, the city of Barcelona has implemented a participatory budgeting process that allows residents to decide directly how a portion of the municipal budget is spent. The city council sets the parameters, but the actual allocation is determined by community assemblies. This process embodies Wu Wei by limiting the central authority's direct control over spending while empowering citizens to shape their own environment. The result has been increased civic engagement, more equitable distribution of resources, and a stronger sense of communal responsibility. Second, the open-source software movement offers a digital analog of Wu Wei governance. Projects like Linux are coordinated by a core group of maintainers who set broad technical directions but allow thousands of contributors worldwide to develop, test, and improve code autonomously. The maintainers intervene only when the project's coherence or security is at risk. This light-touch coordination has produced some of the most robust and widely used software in the world, demonstrating that complex systems can thrive under a model of minimal central control, guided instead by shared values and mutual respect. Both examples illustrate how Wu Wei can be translated into concrete mechanisms, set the framework, trust the participants, and intervene only when necessary to preserve the integrity of the whole. They also highlight the ethical dimension of such governance. It respects the agency of individuals, fosters responsibility, and builds a culture of mutual trust. Returning to the ancient texts for a final reflective quote, Laozi writes, "When the Great Way is forgotten, the people become restless. When the Great Way is remembered, the people are at peace." The Great Way, Tao, is not a rigid set of laws, but an underlying pattern of harmony. A ruler who aligns with this pattern does not need to enforce order through force. Order emerges naturally when the people feel that their innate capacities are recognized and respected. In sum, the philosophy of Wu Wei offers a compelling lens through which to view ethical behavior and statecraft. Its historical roots in the reigns of King Wen and the Tang dynasty. Its echoes in modern policies such as Bhutan's gross national happiness and libertarian minimal state theory. And its resonance with contemporary concepts like soft power and deliberative democracy all point to a timeless insight. The most durable forms of governance often arise not from the imposition of power, but from the wise restraint of it. Yet we must remain vigilant to the critiques of Machiavelli and Hobbes, recognizing that in moments of crisis decisive action may be required. The art of Wu Wei is not a doctrine of passivity. It is an art of discerning when to act and when to step back, guided by a deep attunement to the natural flow of human affairs. As the Song scholar officials demonstrated, quiet governance demands continuous attention to the subtle signs of social health, as Mao's early experiments caution us. Invoking Wu Wei without genuine commitment can mask coercion. Ultimately, the challenge for any ruler, policymaker, or citizen is to cultivate the inner stillness that allows one to perceive the underlying currents of society, and then to align one's actions with those currents. In doing so, we honor both the ancient wisdom of the Taoist sages and the modern aspirations for a just, compassionate, and resilient world. The journey toward governing by letting go is not a single policy choice, but an ongoing practice of humility, listening, and mindful restraint. It invites us to ask with each decision, whether we are shaping the world with a heavy hand or simply guiding it as a gentle wind that lifts the sails of a ship toward its natural horizon. Imagine, for a moment, the brush poised above the rice paper, the ink swelling in the well, the faint scent of sandalwood drifting through the studio. The hand does not force the line, it merely follows the pulse of the mind, the breath that steadies in the quiet of early morning. In that instant, the ancient Taoist principle of Wu Wei, often rendered as non-action or effortless action, finds its most tangible expression. The stroke that emerges is not the product of willful striving, but the harmonious alignment of intention, body, and environment. This is the first of the everyday practices we will explore, the flowing brush strokes of Chinese calligraphy, an art form that has, for centuries, served as a laboratory for cultivating Wu Wei. To understand why calligraphy is more than a decorative skill, we must travel back to the Song dynasty. a period when scholar officials such as Sushi, Su Dongpo, and Mi Fu elevated the practice to a moral discipline. Sushi wrote, "The brush is an extension of the heart when the heart is at peace. The brush moves without resistance." In the same vein, Mi Fu famously declared, "A single stroke, when executed in accordance with the Tao, contains the whole universe." These statements are not mere poetic flourish, they articulate a lived philosophy. The act of writing becomes a meditation on the flow of qi. The vital energy that Taoism teaches permeates all things. When the calligrapher attunes his breath to the rhythm of the line, he experiences a state that modern psychologists would label flow, a condition where self-consciousness recedes and action proceeds with a sense of ease. In this way, calligraphy operationalizes Wu Wei. The practitioner does not impose a rigid technique, but rather allows the technique to emerge from a place of inner stillness. Consider the physical mechanics of the brush stroke. The hand, wrist, and elbow move in a coordinated cascade, each segment responding to the subtle torque generated by the previous one. This cascade mirrors the Taoist metaphor of water finding its path. Water does not push forward, it yields, curves, and ultimately moves forward by aligning with the contours of the land. In calligraphy, the brush yields to the texture of the paper, the viscosity of the ink, and the intention of the mind. The result is a line that seems to have its own agency, a line that, in the words of the 9th century calligrapher Yan Zhenqing, flows like a river that knows no obstacles. The line is not a forced imprint, it is a spontaneous expression of a mind that has let go of grasping. Now let us turn to a second embodiment of Wu Wei, one that animates the body rather than the hand, the practice of Tai Chi and the Japanese tea ceremony. Known as Chanoyu, both traditions are grounded in the same Taoist insight that true mastery arises when effort dissolves into natural rhythm. In Tai Chi, the practitioner moves through a sequence of slow, flowing postures that echo the undulating patterns of a river. Each movement is coordinated with the breath, and the mind remains gently attentive, observing sensations without clinging. The famous Tai Chi master Cheng Man Ching taught, "When the mind is still, the body moves without effort. When the body moves without effort, the spirit rises." This teaching encapsulates the core of Wu Wei, action that is not the product of coercive force, but the expression of an inner equilibrium. The tea ceremony, meanwhile, offers a more intimate, ritualized illustration of effortless awareness. In the quiet of a tatami room, the host prepares matcha with deliberate, measured motions, scooping the powdered tea, whisking it into a frothy surface, serving it with a bow. Each gesture is performed with reverence, yet without haste. The tea master Sen no Rikyu, the 16th century visionary who codified the wabi-sabi aesthetic, wrote, "In the simplicity of the tea bowl lies the depth of the universe. To serve tea is to serve the Tao." The ceremony becomes a microcosm of Wu Wei. The host does not strive to impress, but rather allows the tea to reveal its essence through a process that is both mindful and unforced. Both Tai Chi and the tea ceremony share a common thread with calligraphy. They are embodied practices that cultivate a state of effortless awareness. This term, while resonant with Taoist language, also finds a parallel in Zen Buddhism shikantaza, or just sitting. In shikantaza, the practitioner sits upright, eyes half closed, and observes thoughts as they arise, neither grasping nor rejecting them. The aim is not to achieve a particular mental state, but to rest in the natural flow of awareness. As the Zen master Dojin expressed in his Shabo Genzo, "To sit is to be the whole world." The similarity is striking. Both traditions encourage a letting go of contrived effort, inviting the practitioner to align with a deeper, unforced rhythm. Modern mindfulness practices, popularized in the West through the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn and others, have adopted this principle of non-striving awareness. Kabat-Zinn defines mindfulness as paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. The emphasis on non-judgmentally mirrors Wu Wei's call to act without the interference of egoic desire. Yet, as we shall see, the translation of Wu Wei into contemporary contexts is not without controversy. Before we examine the criticisms, let us pause to consider how these practices manifest in everyday life beyond the studio or the dojo. Imagine a software engineer confronting a stubborn bug. Instead of pounding at the keyboard, the engineer steps back, takes a breath, and watches the code flow through the mind. In that moment of relaxed observation, a pattern emerges, a subtle misalignment of a variable that had been overlooked. The solution appears not through forceful analysis, but through a quiet attunement to the problem's structure. This anecdote illustrates how Wu Wei can inform professional decision-making. When the mind is calm, the appropriate action often surfaces spontaneously. without the need for exhaustive deliberation. Similarly, consider a parent navigating a toddler's tantrum. The instinctive reaction might be to intervene aggressively, to impose order, yet a parent who has cultivated effortless awareness may instead breathe, observe the child's emotional wave, and respond with gentle guidance that mirrors the child's rhythm. The child feels seen. The conflict de-escalates, and the parent's calm presence models a mode of being that the child will internalize. In both scenarios, the principle of non-action does not imply inactivity. It implies a responsive, fluid engagement that arises from a centered mind. These real-world applications echo a broader philosophical conversation. The Stoic notion of apatheia, freedom from disruptive passions, shares an affinity with Wu Wei's call for unperturbed action. The Stoic Epictetus taught, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." By suspending judgment, the Stoic aims to act in accordance with nature, much as the Taoist seeks to align with the Tao. Likewise, the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, non-self, undermines the egoic impulse to control, opening a space where actions can arise spontaneously, uncolored by self-interest. Both traditions, though arising in different cultural milieu, converge on the insight that genuine efficacy emerges when the self relinquishes its grip on outcomes. Contemporary cognitive science offers yet another lens. Embodied cognition research suggests that cognition is not confined to the brain, but is distributed across the body and environment. Scholars such as George Lakoff and Mark Johnson argue that our concepts are grounded in sensory-motor experiences. When a calligrapher feels the weight of the brush, the tension in the wrist, the resistance of the paper, these bodily sensations shape the mental representation of the line. In this view, the effortless quality of Wu Wei is not mystical but a physiological reality. The brain's predictive coding mechanisms favor actions that minimize surprise and energy expenditure. When the body and mind are in sync, the neural system operates at a lower metabolic cost, producing the smooth, unforced movements we associate with mastery. Let us now address the first counter-argument that often surfaces in contemporary discourse, the commercialization of mindfulness, which reduces Wu Wei to a productivity hack. In corporate wellness programs, mindfulness is frequently packaged as a tool for increasing focus, reducing stress, and ultimately boosting output. The language shifts from being present to optimizing performance. Critics such as the philosopher Robert Seymour argue that this instrumentalization strips mindfulness of its ethical dimension, turning a practice rooted in compassion and non-attachment into a means of extracting more labor from workers. When Wu Wei is reframed as working smarter, not harder, the original spirit, action aligned with the Tao, not the profit margin, gets lost. The danger here is twofold. First, it creates a false dichotomy between effort and relaxation, suggesting that the only valuable form of non-action is the one that serves economic ends. Second, it can foster a subtle form of self-blame. If a practitioner fails to achieve higher productivity despite mindful practices, they may be told they are not relaxing enough, reinforcing the very tension that Wu Wei seeks to dissolve. In this sense, the commercialization of mindfulness represents a modern misreading of the ancient text, a kind of shallow Wu Wei that privileges external results over inner alignment. A second, more ethically charged critique concerns the risk of passivity when non-action is misapplied to social injustice. Some interpret Wu Wei as an endorsement of disengagement, a philosophical excuse to remain inert in the face of oppression. This reading, however, conflicts with the Taoist understanding that Wu Wei is context-dependent. Lao Tzu writes in the Taoism, "The soft overcomes the hard, the low overcomes the high." The Taoist sage does not withdraw from the world. Rather, he acts in harmony with the larger pattern, intervening when the moment calls for it, and refraining when interference would cause greater harm. The misinterpretation arises when non-action is taken as literal inaction, ignoring the nuance that true non-action is an informed, responsive restraint. Historical precedents illustrate this point. During the Ming Dynasty, the scholar official Wang Yangming advocated for the unity of knowledge and action, arguing that moral insight compels appropriate response. While not a Taoist per se, his synthesis shows that Chinese thought has long recognized the danger of abstract passivity. In modern times, activist movements such as the civil rights struggle in the United States have drawn on principles akin to Wu Wei. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., though rooted in Christian theology, emphasized nonviolent direct action that sought to align moral force with the inevitable tide of justice, rather than imposing force through violent means. The strategy mirrors Wu Wei: intervene at the right moment, with the right amount of force, allowing the moral momentum to carry the change forward. to further illuminate the historical dimension. Let us revisit the Song-era scholar officials who used calligraphy as moral cultivation. In the 11th century, the renowned poet official Zhuangzi wrote, "When the brush rests on the paper, the heart rests as well." For these officials, the act of writing was a daily meditation on virtue. They believed that the disciplined yet fluid strokes could shape character, fostering humility and restraint. Their practice was not a retreat from public duty, rather, it was a preparation for it. By training themselves to act without forced will in the studio, they hoped to govern without coercion in the court, embodying the ideal of a ruler who leads by effortless example. Another anecdote from the 20th century highlights the cross-cultural migration of Wu Wei. In the 1960s, the American New Age movement, eager to escape the mechanistic pressures of post-war industrial society, embraced the phrase, "go with the flow." Figures such as Alan Watts popularized Taoist concepts, interpreting Wu Wei as a call to relinquish the rigid structures of Western rationalism. Watts famously said, "You cannot be a great poet without being a great liar. You cannot be a great philosopher without being a great fool," though his phrasing is provocative. His underlying point was that authenticity arises when we stop forcing ourselves into predefined roles. The counter-cultural embrace of flow sparked a wave of interest in meditation, yoga, and spontaneous artistic expression. Yet, as the commercialization critique reminds us, this wave also gave rise to a market for flow-enhancing gadgets and productivity seminars, again risking the dilution of the original insight. Returning to the present, let us examine how contemporary embodied cognition research validates the ancient wisdom of Wu Wei. Recent studies by neuroscientist Alvaro Franco and colleagues have demonstrated that expert musicians, when improvising, show reduced activity in the prefrontal cortex, a region associated with conscious control, while simultaneously displaying heightened connectivity in sensory-motor networks. This pattern suggests that mastery involves a shift from top-down control to bottom-up responsiveness, a neural signature of effortless action. The same neural dynamics have been observed in elite athletes during the zone, in surgeons performing delicate procedures, and in calligraphers executing a perfect stroke. The convergence across domains underscores a universal principle. When the body and mind are calibrated to the task, the self-regulatory effort recedes, allowing action to unfold naturally. In practical terms, how might a modern practitioner cultivate this state? One technique is to integrate breath-synchronized movement into daily routines. Begin by standing with feet shoulder-width apart, eyes softly focused on a point ahead. Inhale as you raise your arms slowly, palms turning upward, feeling the stretch along the sides of your torso. Exhale as you lower the arms, allowing the weight of the hands to settle back into the earth. Notice the subtle shift in attention. The mind is not chasing thoughts but is anchored in the rhythm of inhalation and exhalation. After a few cycles, extend this awareness to a mundane activity, perhaps washing dishes. Feel the water's temperature, the texture of the plate, the glide of the sponge. Allow each motion to follow the breath, and you will discover that the chore becomes a moving meditation, a microcosm of Wu Wei. Another practice draws directly from Shikantaza. Sit on a cushion, spine straight, hands resting lightly in the lap. Close your eyes gently, and bring attention to the breath as it enters and leaves the nostrils. When thoughts arise, acknowledge them as clouds passing across the sky and let them drift without grasp. The key is not to suppress thoughts, but to refrain from feeding them with judgment or analysis. Over time, this just sitting cultivates a spacious mind that can respond to external demands with clarity and ease. Mirroring the calligrapher's poised brush or the Tai Chi practitioner's fluid form, it is also worthwhile to reflect on the ethical dimension of Wu Wei in the context of social engagement. The Taoist sage does not retreat into isolation, rather, he seeks to influence the world by embodying the Tao, thereby inspiring others through example. This approach aligns with the concept of soft power in international relations, where influence is exerted through cultural appeal rather than coercion. When leaders adopt a posture of calm competence, they can guide societies through turbulence without resorting to authoritarian measures. In this sense, Wu Wei offers a strategic model for leadership that balances firmness with flexibility. Mirroring the Stoic ideal of ruling with apatheia, govern without being ruled by passion. Let us also consider the interplay between Wu Wei and the Buddhist notion of anatta. If there is no enduring self that can claim ownership over actions, then the impulse to force outcomes loses its footing. Actions become spontaneous expressions of interdependent processes, the Zen master Hakuin wrote, "When you realize that there is no self, you no longer need to act to achieve." This insight dissolves the egoic craving for control, opening a space where Wu Wei can flourish. The practitioner, no longer bound by the illusion of a separate agent, can move in harmony with the flow of circumstances, whether that flow is a brushstroke, a tea ceremony, or a societal shift. In the realm of artistic creation, the principle of Wu Wei has been embraced by contemporary musicians and visual artists who seek to avoid over-intellectualizing their work. The avant-garde composer John Cage, for instance, introduced chance operations into his compositions, allowing randomness to shape the music. Cage's famous statement, "I don't have any desire to be a great composer, I want to be a conduit," echoes the Taoist ideal of the vessel that holds water without claiming ownership. By surrendering personal ego, the artist becomes a channel for the unfolding of the piece, a modern embodiment of effortless action, even in the digital age, where algorithms predict our preferences and automate tasks. The principle of Wu Wei offers a counterbalance. Consider the design of user interfaces that aim for invisible technology, systems that anticipate needs without demanding explicit commands. When a smartphone learns your routine and offers suggestions seamlessly, it mirrors the Taoist ideal of acting without imposing. Yet this also raises ethical questions about agency and consent, reminding us that Wu Wei must be applied with discernment, ensuring that the effortless does not become a covert exertion of control. Returning to the tea ceremony, let us unpack the subtle choreography that illustrates Wu Wei in social interaction. The host's movements are deliberately slow, each gesture calibrated to the rhythm of the room. When the host reaches for the tea bowl, the hand does not grasp aggressively. Instead, it glides as if the bowl were already part of the hand. The guest, observing this calm, mirrors the pace, creating a shared field of awareness. The tea itself, prepared with precise temperature and whisking technique, becomes a medium through which both participants experience a moment of unified presence. The ceremony thus serves as a micro-social experiment in which non-action, absence of forced performance, produces a deeper connection. As the tea master Sen no Rikyu observed, the true purpose of tea is not to satisfy thirst, but to awaken the heart. In Tai Chi, the concept of song, Chinese letter, often translated as relaxation, is central. Song is not mere physical looseness. It is a dynamic state where muscles are supple, joints are free, and the mind remains alert. When a practitioner achieves song, the body can respond instantly to external forces, redirecting energy rather than resisting it. This principle has been studied in biomechanics, where researchers have measured reduced joint torque and lower muscular activation in Tai Chi practitioners compared to those performing conventional resistance exercises. The findings suggest that the effortless quality of Wu Wei is not a myth, but a measurable physiological state, reinforcing the ancient claim that true strength lies in yielding. Let us now revisit the Stoic counterpart, apatheia, to draw a comparative insight. The Stoic philosopher Seneca wrote, "He who is brave is free," freedom. For the Stoic is the ability to act without being enslaved by passions. This parallels the Taoist aim of acting without being enslaved by desire or fear. Both traditions converge on the idea that a clear mind, unclouded by internal turbulence, can navigate external circumstances with precision. In practice, a Stoic might cultivate apatheia through daily reflection, journaling about emotional triggers, while a Taoist might achieve similar clarity through calligraphy or Tai Chi. The methods differ, but the endpoint, a mind capable of effortless, appropriate action, remains consistent. In contemporary psychotherapy, especially acceptance and commitment therapy (ACT), practitioners encourage clients to observe thoughts without judgment, akin to shikantaza, and to commit to values-driven actions. This therapeutic model reflects Wu Wei's balance of acceptance and engagement. Accept the present moment as it is, yet act in alignment with deeper purpose. The therapist's guidance to diffuse thoughts, seeing them as passing clouds, mirrors the Taoist practice of letting go of mental constructs that obstruct natural flow. Now, let us address a potential misconception that Wu Wei advocates for a passive resignation to fate. The Taoist text itself warns against fatalism. In chapter 48 of the Tao Te Ching, Lao Tzu says, "The highest good is like water. Water benefits all things and does not compete. It stays low, yet it is the source of life. Water does not surrender to fate. It adapts. It finds the path of least resistance, and it shapes the landscape over time." The Taoist sage, therefore, is an active participant who navigates change with flexibility, not a spectator who watches events unfold unaltered. To illustrate this active flexibility, Consider the story of the 12th century Chinese poet Li Bai, who was known for his spontaneous verses. Legend recounts that Li Bai once walked through a bustling market, heard the clamor of merchants, and without premeditation composed a poem that captured the market's rhythm. He did not force the poem, it emerged as a natural response to the environment. This anecdote demonstrates that Wu Wei does not deny creativity, it channels it through attunement to the present moment. Similarly, in the Western artistic tradition, the Impressionist painters such as Claude Monet sought to capture fleeting light and atmosphere by painting en plein air, allowing the scene's transients to dictate brushwork. Monet's own words, "I must have a certain amount of light in my studio," reveal an awareness that artistic expression must be in harmony with natural conditions, a sentiment resonant with Taoist non-intervention. In the modern corporate world, there are emerging leadership models that echo Wu Wei's principles. Servant leadership, popularized by Robert K. Greenleaf, emphasizes leading by serving others, creating an environment where employees can act autonomously. The leader's role is not to micromanage, but to remove obstacles. Much like a riverbank that guides water without damming it, this approach aligns with the Taoist admonition that the best ruler is one whose presence is barely felt. By fostering a culture of trust and empowerment, organizations can achieve high performance without the friction of heavy-handed control. Nevertheless, we must remain vigilant against the tendency to romanticize Wu Wei as a panacea for all modern ailments. The principle, while powerful, requires disciplined cultivation. It demands regular practice, whether through calligraphy, Tai Chi, meditation, or mindful daily chores, to develop the sensitivity needed to discern when to act and when to refrain. As the Taoist sage Zhuangzi wrote, "The perfect man employs his mind like a mirror. It reflects without holding on to anything." The mirror metaphor underscores that effortlessness is not the absence of effort, but the mastery of effort through continual refinement. In conclusion, the everyday practice of Wu Wei weaves together art, movement, and mindful awareness into a tapestry that transcends cultural boundaries and historical epochs. The flowing brush strokes of Chinese calligraphy teach us that the mind's tranquility can be inscribed onto material reality, each line a testament to effortless alignment. The embodied calm of Tai Chi in the tea ceremony demonstrates how the body, when synchronized with breath and intention, becomes a conduit for serene action. Meditation techniques such as shikantaza and modern mindfulness reinforce the mental dimension, inviting us to rest in a spacious awareness that does not cling to outcomes. Counter-arguments remind us that the principle can be distorted, either commodified as a productivity tool or misread as a license for passivity, but these critiques also sharpen our understanding, urging us to preserve the ethical core of Wu Wei. Historical anecdotes from Song-era scholar officials who used calligraphy as moral training to the 1960s counter-culture's "go with the flow" mantra show how the principle has migrated, adapted, and sometimes been diluted. Cross-references to Stoic apatheia, Buddhist anatta, and contemporary embodied cognition research reveal a convergence of thought across traditions, suggesting that the insight of effortless action is a universal human discovery. By integrating these perspectives, we gain a richer, multidimensional view of Wu Wei that honors its depth while inviting practical application. So, as you pick up a brush, step onto a mat, or simply wash a plate, remember that the goal is not to force a result, but to align yourself with the subtle currents that already exist. In doing so, you embody the Tao. You become the river that shapes the stone, not by brute force, but by gentle persistence. And in that gentle persistence lies the true power of Wu Wei, the ability to act without effort, to influence without imposing, to create without striving, and ultimately to live in harmony with the ever-flowing tapestry of existence. When we turn our gaze from the ancient bamboo groves of the Taoist sages to the bustling streets of today's megacities, we might wonder how a principle as subtle as Wu Wei, effortless action, could possibly speak to the tangled problems of climate change, corporate efficiency, and social justice. The answer, I think, lies not in a literal transplantation of a millennia-old practice, but in the way Wu Wei invites us to listen to the rhythms that already exist beneath the surface of our world, and to align our interventions with those currents rather than against them. In this segment, we will wander through contemporary fields where that invitation is being heard. We will pause at the crossroads where it is being contested, and we will trace the threads that link Wu Wei to deep ecology, existential authenticity, and Heidegger's warning about technology as standing reserve. Let us begin with a story that blossoms in the soil, a story of regenerative agriculture. Imagine a farmer in the rolling hills of the American Midwest, standing at the edge of a field that has, for generations, been treated as a commodity to be maximized. The conventional wisdom, seed, spray, harvest, repeat, has turned the land into a mechanistic production line. Yet in recent years, a growing number of growers have begun to practice what they call regenerative agriculture, a set of methods that aim not to dominate the earth but to work with its natural cycles. They plant cover crops that fix nitrogen. They rotate livestock to mimic the migratory patterns of wild herds. They allow soils to rest and rebuild their organic matter. In the words of the agronomist David Montgomery, the soil is a living organism. It responds to how we treat it. This perspective echoes the Taoist insight that the highest good is like water, Zhuangzi, Tao Te Ching 2. For water does not force its way but follows the lowest places, nourishing without imposing. When the farmer lets the land recover, the yields often increase, not because of more inputs, but because the ecosystem itself becomes more resilient. The principle at work here is not a passive surrender but an attentive responsiveness, a core of Wu Wei. The farmer does not try to control every variable. Instead, they observe the signs of the soil, the timing of rain, the behavior of pollinators, and they adjust their actions accordingly. The result is a kind of agricultural choreography, a dance where human hands guide the steps but do not dictate the music. As the Taoist classic says, a man of great virtue is like a newborn child who does not yet have any preconceived ideas, Zhuangzi. In her chapters too, the farmer in this sense returns to a state of openness, allowing the land's own intelligence to surface. Regenerative agriculture is not an isolated anecdote. It is part of a broader movement that includes agroforestry, permaculture, and holistic grazing. Each of these practices shares a common thread. They seek to align human activity with the regenerative capacities of ecosystems rather than to exhaust them. In doing so, they embody a contemporary reading of Wu Wei that resonates with deep ecology's call for the intrinsic value of all living beings. Arne Nice, The Shallow and the Deep. 1973. Deep ecology argues that the human-nature relationship should be reconceived as one of mutual flourishing, not of domination. Wu Wei offers a methodological lens for that reconception. It suggests that the most effective way to foster flourishing is to reduce the friction between intention and natural process, to act in such a way that the world's own self-organizing tendencies are respected. From the fields to the boardrooms, a similar logic has been appropriated in the realm of corporate management, particularly in the philosophy known as lean management, which originated in the Japanese automobile industry under the banner of the Toyota production system, is often described as an effort to eliminate waste, overproduction, excess inventory, unnecessary motion. The idea is to streamline processes so that value flows to the customer with minimal friction. In its most sincere form, lean is an exercise in Wu Wei. It asks managers to step back, to map the value stream, to identify where the system is resisting, and then to remove those obstacles rather than to impose new layers of control. Consider a tech startup that has adopted lean principles. Instead of mandating a rigid hierarchy of approvals, the team adopts a just-in-time approach to decision-making. When a developer encounters a bottleneck, the response is not to add more managers, but to ask, what is the underlying constraint? How can we redesign the workflow so that the constraint disappears? This is reminiscent of the Zhuangzi anecdote of the cook who effortlessly prepares a fish without forcing it, because he knows the fish's nature. In both cases, the practitioner refrains from imposing willful force, opting instead for a gentle rearrangement that lets the system's own capacities emerge. The synergy between lean management and Wu Wei becomes even clearer when we examine the concept of removing interference. In Taoist thought, interference is the source of disorder. Laozi warns, when the great Tao is forgotten, there is chaos. When the great virtue is lost, there is disorder. In a corporate setting, interference often takes the form of micromanagement, excessive reporting, or a culture of constant surveillance. By stripping away these layers, lean managers aim to restore a kind of organizational flow that mirrors the natural flow of water finding its path of least resistance. The result, when it works, is a workplace where employees feel empowered to act spontaneously, where innovation arises not from top-down directives, but from the bottom-up recognition of real needs. Yet, as with any philosophical principle that migrates across contexts, the translation of Wu Wei into modern practice is not without tension. One of the most pressing critiques comes from a neoliberal perspective that sees efficiency as a synonym for profit maximization. Critics argue that the language of effortless action can be co-opted to justify the removal of labor protections, the outsourcing of environmental responsibility, and the acceleration of automation, all under the banner of lean or sustainable practices. In this reading, Wu Wei becomes a veil for what Martin Heidegger would later call standing reserve, Bestand, the tendency of technology to treat everything, including humans and nature, as resources to be ordered, stored, and deployed. Heidegger's analysis of standing reserve warns us that when we view the world merely as a stockpile of exploitable assets, we lose sight of its intrinsic worth. He writes, "The essence of technology is by no means anything technological, in the neoliberal appropriation of Wu Wei. The essence of the principle, its humility and reverence for natural order, gets eclipsed by a technological mindset that seeks to harness that humility for the purpose of extraction. A corporation might claim, 'We are adopting lean principles to reduce waste,' while simultaneously laying off workers, consolidating farms, and pushing for monocultures that promise higher yields but degrade biodiversity. The effortless becomes a euphemism for unseen labor and hidden externalities. The critique, therefore, is not that Wu Wei is inherently complicit, but that its language can be instrumentalized to mask exploitative dynamics." A second, equally potent line of criticism emerges from feminist and post-colonial scholars who interrogate the power structures embedded in the very notion of non-interference. They ask, whose harmony are we preserving when Wu Wei is invoked to justify a hands-off approach to governance? Does it not risk preserving existing hierarchies that marginalize women, indigenous peoples, and other subaltern groups? In the context of environmental policy, for example, the call to let nature take its course can be used to dismiss the rights of communities that have historically been displaced by conservation projects. The critique draws on the work of scholars like Vandana Shiva, who argues that the discourse of non-intervention often silences the voices of those who are most affected by ecological change. From a post-colonial standpoint, the appropriation of a Chinese philosophical concept by Western corporations can also be read as a form of cultural extraction, a soft power maneuver that strips the concept of its historical depth and repackages it for profit. The risk, then, is that Wu Wei becomes a tool for maintaining the status quo, a rhetorical shield that deflects responsibility. When a multinational agribusiness declares that it will practice Wu Wei in its supply chain, the statement may sound serene, yet the underlying power dynamics, control over land, labor, and market access remain unchanged. The critique invites us to ask, is the principle being used to genuinely reduce interference, or merely to rebrand interference in a more palatable guise? To understand how these tensions have unfolded historically, let us travel back to the 1990s, when China embarked on a series of environmental reforms that explicitly invoked Taoist ideas of harmony. In the early 1990s, the Chinese government faced mounting air and water pollution crises, especially in the rapidly industrializing coastal provinces. In response, the Ministry of Environmental Protection launched a campaign called Harmony with Nature, He Zuren. Officials cited Laozi's teaching that the soft overcomes the hard to argue for a shift from heavy industry toward cleaner technologies and more balanced regional development. The campaign led to the establishment of ecological red line policies, which set aside certain river basins and forested regions as untouchable zones, protected not merely for their economic value, but for their role in maintaining ecological equilibrium. The anecdote of the Three Gorges River management illustrates both the promise and the pitfalls of this approach. In the mid-1990s, engineers were tasked with regulating the flow of the Zhuangzi River to prevent flooding while also preserving fish habitats. Rather than imposing a rigid dam schedule, they consulted local fishermen, studied seasonal migration patterns, and adjusted water releases to align with natural spawning cycles. The result was a reduction in flood damage and a modest recovery of fish populations, an embodiment of Wu Wei in large-scale infrastructure. However, critics later pointed out that the same project displaced millions of people, and that the harmonious narrative glossed over the social costs. The historical episode reminds us that invoking harmony can be a powerful motivator for ecological stewardship. Yet it can also be wielded to sidestep accountability. A more recent historical anecdote comes from the global mindfulness industry, a phenomenon that has taken the language of ancient contemplative practices and turned it into a multi-billion-dollar market. Since the early 2000s, corporations have offered mindfulness training to employees. Universities have created mindfulness labs, and apps like Headspace and Calm have sold millions of subscriptions. Proponents argue that mindfulness, a practice that in its Taoist and Buddhist roots, cultivates a state of non-attachment and effortless awareness, helps workers reduce stress, increase focus, and ultimately become more productive. The narrative is compelling. If we can teach employees to be present, then they will make better decisions, innovate more freely, and align with the company's goals without the friction of anxiety. Yet scholars such as Ronald Purser and Sarah Ahmed have mounted a robust pushback, contending that the commodification of mindfulness turns a transformative practice into a tool of corporate control. Purser writes, when mindfulness is packaged as a performance-enhancing technique, it becomes a means of disciplining the workforce, encouraging them to adapt to oppressive conditions rather than challenge them. The critique parallels the feminist concern that Wu Wei, when framed as non-interference, can be used to legitimize the status quo. In the mindfulness context, the effortless state is marketed as a way to accept demanding work schedules, to internalize stress, and to keep the labor force compliant. The historical trajectory of mindfulness thus serves as a cautionary tale. The language of inner calm can be repurposed to serve external power structures. Having examined both the promising applications and the critical perspectives, we can now explore how Wu Wei intersects with other philosophical currents that have shaped contemporary environmental and technological thought. Deep ecology, as we noted earlier, emphasizes the inherent worth of all living beings and calls for a radical shift in human consciousness. The deep ecologist Arne Nies coined the term self-realization to describe the moment when an individual recognizes their identity as part of a larger ecological whole. Wu Wei provides a practical methodology for that realization. By acting without force, we begin to feel the subtle feedback loops that bind us to the earth. In this sense, Wu Wei can be seen as an embodied practice of deep ecology, a way to translate abstract ethical commitments into lived experience. Existential authenticity, a concept articulated by Martin Heidegger and later by Jean-Paul Sartre, asks us to confront the thrownness of our existence and to choose our own path in the face of an indifferent world. Heidegger's notion of Gelassenheit, often translated as releasement, bears a striking resemblance to Wu Wei. Gelassenheit is the attitude of letting be, of allowing things to emerge without the constant impulse to dominate. When we adopt Wu Wei in our daily decisions, whether in farming, management, or personal conduct, we are, in a sense, practicing an authentic mode of being that acknowledges our finitude while still engaging creatively with the world. The authenticity of the farmer who listens to the soil, or the manager who removes bureaucratic friction, becomes a concrete illustration of Heidegger's call to own up to one's own most potentiality for being. Finally, Heidegger's critique of technology as standing reserve offers a sobering counterpoint. Standing reserve reduces the world to a stockpile of resources awaiting extraction, a view that is antithetical to the Taoist vision of the world as a living, relational whole. When corporations adopt lean principles without a deeper ethical grounding, they risk turning lean into a more efficient form of standing reserve. They streamline the extraction of value, but the underlying relationship to nature and labor remains one of domination. The challenge, then, is to embed Wu Wei within a broader ethical framework that resists the instrumentalization of nature and people. This is where the cross-reference to deep ecology and existential authenticity becomes vital. They provide the normative anchors that keep the practice of effortless action from slipping into a thin veneer for exploitation. Let us now return to concrete examples that illustrate both the promise and the peril of applying Wu Wei today. In the realm of regenerative agriculture, the work of the Rodale Institute in Pennsylvania offers a compelling case study. Since the 1970s, the Institute has run long-term trials comparing conventional tillage with no-till cover crop systems. The results have shown that no-till fields retain up to 30% more water, sequester significantly more carbon, and require fewer synthetic inputs. The Institute's director often says, "We are not fighting the soil, we are partnering with it." This partnership mirrors the Taoist counsel that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest, lay as he ate, by allowing the soil's own microbial life to flourish. Farmers achieve higher productivity without the heavy hand of chemical fertilizers, a clear embodiment of effortless action. A second contemporary illustration comes from the corporate world, where the software company Basecamp, now known as 37 Signals, has famously embraced a no-meeting policy and a minimalist product development approach. The founder, Jason Fried, has written that the best work happens when you give people the space to think, to fail, and to iterate on their own. The The company's culture is built around the idea that interference, whether in the form of endless status updates or invasive performance metrics, actually hinders creativity. By stepping back, managers enable teams to self-organize, to respond to user feedback in real time, and to release updates that feel natural rather than forced. This practice can be read as a corporate translation of Wu Wei. The organization refrains from imposing rigid structures, allowing the flow of ideas to emerge organically. Yet, as we have seen, the same principle can be weaponized. In the fast food industry, for instance, the phrase lean is often used to describe a supply chain that minimizes waste but also squeezes margins for suppliers and workers. The chain may tout its lean operations as environmentally friendly, while simultaneously lobbying for deregulation that allows for larger, more efficient processing plants that, in effect, become massive standing reserve machines. The paradox is stark. The language of effortless efficiency is employed to justify a deeper intensification of extraction. The feminist and post-colonial critique sharpens this paradox. When multinational agribusinesses promote wu-wei farming in developing countries, they may encourage smallholders to adopt low-input methods that appear harmonious with local ecosystems. However, these methods are often tied to proprietary seed varieties, patented technologies, or contractual obligations that lock farmers into a dependency cycle. The effortless narrative masks a new form of control, one that reproduces colonial power dynamics under the guise of ecological stewardship. As scholar Anna Eltsing reminds us, the global supply chain is a web of entanglements that cannot be reduced to simple narratives of harmony. The critique urges us to examine who benefits from the reduced friction and who bears the hidden costs. In the arena of mindfulness, the pushback from scholars is equally instructive. A 2020 article in the Journal of Business Ethics argued that corporate mindfulness programs often fail to address the structural sources of employee stress, long hours, precarious contracts, lack of autonomy, by simply teaching individuals to be present. The authors quote the Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh: "When we are mindful, we are not merely aware of the present, we are aware of the interdependence that creates the present." If a company's mindfulness only trains employees to endure their conditions, it does not fulfill the deeper interdependent awareness that the practice originally intended. The critique thus aligns with the Taoist warning that the sage does not accumulate knowledge, he accumulates virtue, suggesting that genuine Wu Wei cannot be reduced to a set of techniques divorced from their ethical context. What then does it mean to practice Wu Wei responsibly in the contemporary world? One approach is to treat Wu Wei not as a static doctrine, but as an ongoing, reflective process, a habit of mind that continuously asks, what is the natural tendency of this system? Where am I creating unnecessary resistance? This question can be applied at multiple scales. At the policy level, governments might ask whether a new regulation aligns with the ecological cycles of a watershed, rather than imposing a top-down mandate that disrupts seasonal flows. At the organizational level, leaders might ask whether a performance metric is a genuine indicator of value or merely a lever that pushes employees into endless competition. At the personal level, individuals might consider whether their daily routines, commuting, consumption, digital habits are in harmony with their own well-being and the broader planetary health. In practice, this reflective stance can be cultivated through concrete habits that echo the Taoist tradition of watching the water. For example, the practice of slow data, collecting and analyzing information at a pace that respects the time it takes for ecosystems to respond, offers a methodological counterpart to fast-paced, data-driven decision-making that often overlooks long-term consequences. By slowing down, we give the system space to reveal its own patterns, allowing us to intervene only where truly needed. Similarly, the concept of circular economy, designing products for reuse, repair, and regeneration, embodies Wu Wei by minimizing the need for continual extraction and waste. The circular approach does not force the market to produce ever more. Instead, it lets the natural tendency toward reuse guide economic activity. Cross-referencing these ideas with existential authenticity, we see a common emphasis on self-determination. Heidegger writes, "Only a being that is aware of its own most potentiality can act authentically." When we align our actions with the natural flow of things, we are not surrendering agency, we are exercising a deeper form of agency, one that is attuned to the conditions of possibility. In this sense, Wu Wei becomes a form of ethical agency, a way of saying, I will act, but I will do so in a way that honors the world's own capacities. It is a stance that resists the temptation to dominate. While still acknowledging that action is necessary, let us pause now to reflect on a quotation from Zhuangzi that encapsulates this balance. He who conquers others has force, he who conquers himself has strength. The strength referred to here is not muscular or coercive power, but the quiet potency that arises when one's actions are no longer driven by egoistic desire, but by an attuned responsiveness to the world. In the modern context, this might look like a city planner who resists the urge to impose a monolithic highway, and instead works with community members to develop a network of bike lanes and green corridors that follow the natural topography. The result is a transportation system that moves people efficiently without crushing the surrounding environment, a city that flows like water. Rather than a concrete dam, we have also seen, however, how the same principle can be twisted. The neoliberal critique reminds us that efficiency can become a code word for cost-cutting at any human or ecological price. The feminist and post-colonial critique warns that non-interference can be a polite way of saying no responsibility. These critiques are not merely academic, they point to real policy battles over land rights, labor standards, and corporate accountability. When a multinational corporation declares that it will adopt Wu-Wei-inspired practices, we must ask whose voices are being heard in the decision-making process, who is being asked to step back, and who is being asked to step forward. The answers to those questions determine whether Wu Wei becomes a liberating principle or a tool of domination. In the final analysis, the contemporary relevance of Wu Wei lies in its capacity to reorient our relationship with the world from one of domination to one of partnership. Whether we are sowing seeds in a field, designing a workflow in an office, or drafting a climate policy, the core question remains the same. Are we creating friction that amplifies our own hubris, or are we allowing the inherent order of the system to guide us? The answer is never simple, because every intervention carries both intention and impact. Yet the practice of Wu Wei offers a compass, a way to navigate the complex terrain of modern life with humility, patience, and an ear for the subtle cues that nature constantly offers. As we close this exploration, I invite you to carry with you 3 reflective prompts. First, observe a situation in your own life where you feel compelled to force an outcome. Pause, breathe, and ask, what would happen if you stepped back and let the situation reveal its own path? Second, consider a community or organization you are part of. Identify one layer of interference, perhaps an unnecessary meeting, a redundant report, a policy that ignores local knowledge, and imagine how removing that layer might open space for more natural, effective action. Third, reflect on the power dynamics at play. Who benefits when friction is reduced, and who might be left behind? By holding these questions in mind, we honor the Taoist spirit of continual inquiry, and we keep alive the possibility that Wu Wei can be a living, evolving practice, one that nurtures both the earth and the human heart, rather than merely serving the interests of profit or control. In the words of Zhuangzi, the perfect man employs his mind like a mirror, always clean, always reflecting, never holding on to anything. May we each strive to become that mirror, reflecting the world as it is, acting when the moment calls and letting go when the moment does not. And in doing so, may we find that the most profound power lies not in the force we exert, but in the ease with which we align ourselves with the ever-flowing Tao.